I'm gonna go ahead and turn on what we're doing in the tone curve. I can't help myself, I'll probably do a little bit too much, but we'll keep it as minimal as possible. Kind of like the fill light, I'm just moving this slider. I reached out to the email community to submit a few photos to be featured in today's video. We got some really good ones. Y'all are super talented. And props to everybody who had the courage to submit these photos to be viewed by all of us. Let's have some fun. Oh, and this is a subjective thing. I'm not sure if my edits are gonna make these photos better. They might even make them worse. Y'all might be able to do a way better job than I can do. It's subjective, but I'm gonna do my best. I'll show you my process. Maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you'll hate my edits. Either way, it's all good. And if you're not a part of the email community and you wanna be a part of it, I'll put a link down below so you can join us if you wanna be a part of something like this in the future. Our first photo here, which I'm really excited to edit, is submitted by Brian, who said, I wanna see how a non-architectural photographer will edit this particular photograph. I look forward to seeing your next video. Sent from a young man who just graduated as a master architect. Cheers from Switzerland. First off, congrats on the graduation as a master architect. I don't feel worthy to edit this photo. Fantastic work. And Brian, I was checking out your IG. I was incredibly impressed. Y'all gotta go check out these architecture photos that Brian's doing and send him a note. Let him know you came across his page through this video. That'd make my day. I'm sure to make his too, but tons of good stuff on there. Okay, when I first came across this photo, I knew that right off the bat, I knew I wanted to keep the focus on all of these incredibly perfect and symmetrical angles. And I didn't want to distract from that by doing too much focus on any color. So I knew I was going monochromatic and I'm probably wanting to go really high contrast, which creates a perfect opportunity to use my space preset here. Don't worry, it's not gonna be one of those videos I'm just gonna slap on a preset, say, what do you guys think? The edit's done. Anyways, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, see ya. No, we're not doing that. Yes, I'll be using my presets as my baseline because I do that for all my photo edits, but it's just my starting point. I'm gonna go through, when I apply a preset, I'm gonna go through every single panel, show you guys exactly how those presets are manipulating this image, and then I'm gonna do some masking and some overall editing. We're gonna do a lot, but if you wanna even steal those preset settings, I'm gonna show you exactly what all of them are. So you can steal them, save them as your own preset, it's all good. Or if you actually wanna save some time, those presets are available for purchase. Okay, so I've already applied the space preset here, but again, I have a bunch of panels turned off and I have some masking even turned off at this point, so I'm gonna show you every single thing that I would do to this image. Okay, in the first panel here, the first thing here is the Adobe standard black and white, so now we're editing in this monochromatic feel, and the exposure is the first thing that I cranked way up. So we go back to how it was exposed, it's kind of flat, and I found that with black and white stuff, I really wanna go for ridiculously high contrast most times, and cranking the exposure when it works tends to give this kind of this glossy feel and just this very abrupt contrast. So I like cranking the exposure there. Next piece here is fill light. And this is just something that when I apply the space preset, I'm just finding the right point where I like it. I like this one turned down. If I go too high, obviously we're getting way too much fill, and then I'm reducing that contrasted feel. So I have that turned down pretty low. And then the blacks, there's not much happening here. If I put them in the wrong spot, there's a lot happening. So I just turn those up. And this is again, kind of like the fill light. I'm just moving this slider after I have this preset and seeing what I like. Obviously that's way too, I actually kind of like it, but that's probably way too dark. So I just have that somewhere in the middle on how much those blacks are getting kind of crunched down. And then next is the brightness, and same idea. We're just going for moving these sliders, like what's gonna feel right. And I have that brightness actually pretty high, continuing off that high exposure, high contrast, ridiculously bright highlights. And then contrast, yeah, you guessed it. I cranked that all the way up. There's a lot happening there. Clarity, the last thing I wanna do to this image is just crank the clarity. I'm not really loving that. Yes, I want to have some clarity on those lines, but I tend to keep these cameras are shooting, I think this was shot on an A7S III. These cameras are already doing such a good job with clarity that I usually keep that at 0, if not bringing it down a little bit. I will add some spot clarity later. That's how I tend to use clarity. Okay, the next thing that I have turned off here is just the tone curve. So I'll show you what's going on here. I'm gonna turn that tone curve on. So off and on. I just have a little bit of a roll off in the shadows to the highlights. Not a drastic S curve here, just a little bit going on to get a little bit more of a consistent roll off between the shadows and the highlights, but pretty straightforward there. The next piece is actually just detail. So I have the detail, and if I'm not reviewing some of these other panels, it's because I didn't do anything to them. especially with black and white photos. There's not much to be said on like split toning, for example. So next piece here for detail, all I've really done, if I hold Option and hold this masking, you can see the white areas. These are the edges that we're actually applying this mask to. I usually crank that all the way up. And then what I found best for these sliders is to make it look like we're going up steps. So 1, 2, 3, in that angle tends to work best. This is pretty subjective, but if I apply, you're not gonna see much here, but I'm gonna turn this effect, turn it off, and look at the edges, and then I'll turn it back on. We're just adding some sharpening to those edges, which this photo, we want that absolutely. And that's actually it for all the basic edits. There's no other panels that I'm doing, but I am doing a pretty heavy amount in the masking here. Masking is where I'm gonna add some light detail to this photo and kind of make it this final little touch to make it really pop. Actually, one piece on the crop, I first went in, I was like, all right, let's straighten this thing out. It's already perfectly shot, which is not surprising knowing what we know about Brian at this point. It's perfectly symmetrical. I have no lines to straighten out whatsoever, so great work there. Back over here on masking, this is my final touches to the photo. I want to make it pop, and when I see this, what really comes to mind for me is how can I add some clarity to all of these edges here, and maybe a little bit more contrast, and then this big spot. I could have taken the approach of like bringing the exposure down, the highlights down, you can see some of the clouds. I just think that takes away from all of these incredible angles. So I'm actually gonna create a big mask here, and I'm gonna create some halation and kind of bloom out these highlights. I think it gives this kind of this soft feel at the top with these really hard edges coming into it. It makes it kind of cool, just playing on that contrast even further. So I'm gonna turn on what I've done here, and I'll show you what that is. The first thing here, you can see I've just created a big radial mask, and all that I've done there is I increased the brightness a little bit. You can see what that's doing. It's not much. We're just adding a bit more pop there. And then this is the big one here. I've turned this clarity all the way down, and you can just see that's lightly just giving us this like halation aspect to some of those highlights. Next, I just drew a brush mask, so I just painted around all of here. And you can see here that I actually, when I did that painting, let me turn that mask on. When I did that painting, I made sure not to paint all the way up here because I want that halation to come through. So I painted everything down here, and we brought the contrast just up just a touch. And then the clarity here, this is the big one, we did the opposite. So I'm gonna bring this all the way down, right? You can see the difference here versus where it was up here. We're adding some clarity in here and getting those lines to really pop. And this is what we're left with in terms of a before and after. Brian, again, fantastic work. And I swear I did this after I edited this photo. I went to your IG, and I was like, I wonder if Brian edited this photo himself. And I started scrolling, it took me a second, and sure enough, you did. And look at high contrast, monochrome edit. Brian, great minds, again, fantastic work. Bill sent over our next image today, and I can't wait to edit this one. The horizon's perfectly straight. It's kind of like some stacked things here. We have, by that I mean there's some good stuff in the foreground. We have a clear subject, and there's this really cool kind of haze up here. We're gonna make that haze pop today. Bill's doing some really cool things on his YouTube channel. He also said that he's gonna be wanting to do, potentially, might hold you to this, but doing a reaction video on his channel based on how I edit this, so no pressure or anything. When I first saw this, I knew I wanted to go with like a really warm tone, get this center point to really pop, and then play off of this haze here. And for those warm tones, I love using my deception. You can see what that's doing here, my deception preset. The standard one doesn't apply a fade, the fade one does fade the blacks, which is a bit of a dated style, but I love how that fade looks on this image, and that's exactly what we're gonna be using. I've got the deception fade preset applied here. It's not done. I've hidden a lot of panels of what's actually happening here. We're gonna start with the basic panel, kind of uncover this image here a little bit. This preset's gonna bump the exposure a little bit. That's more preference. I'm gonna keep it where it was set. And it's gonna bring the highlights down, shadows up, whites up, blacks up, and you can just play with those sliders. I like keeping them on the sides of this line that they're on when I apply a preset, but I'll usually like and change the intensity a little bit of each of them, but generally keeping them in this format. And on my presets, I tend to keep the clarity down a little bit. Usually a rookie mistake is to crank the clarity thinking we need it to be ultra clear. These cameras are pushing so much clarity that I think keeping it down a little bit tends to make the image look a bit more natural, and it's still plenty sharp. A general rule of thumb is I keep the saturation down slightly too. I'll play with the saturation of different tones in different panels here, but keeping that pretty much as I have it in in the preset here. Next, let's go to the tone curve, and this is gonna do a lot to the image. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on what we're doing in the tone curve. And in the tone curve, I'm actually gonna start and show you the RGB panels here. I have the exact same S curve on each one. And one thing you can do once you set how you want like the red, like a light S curve, to get in the exact same, if you just right click, you can go to copy channel settings, go to your next color here, right click, and go to paste channel settings, and you'll get the exact same values. That way you don't have to like try to see what these numbers are doing down here, and it becomes kind of a mess. So the exact same S curve on all of those, and then I have a different S curve on the overall, and this one really is just bringing up. This is where I'm getting my fade, both in my darks and in my lights here, with a light S curve there. But this is doing a ton to the image as we just toggle that on and off. And next, our HSL panel, we're doing a lot here too. Let's go ahead and toggle this on, and the image is gonna change a ton. So you can see how I've set all of this. Most of my presets, I actually don't change the hues too much. I like leaving those standard, but the saturation and luminance is where I'm gonna get a lot of the look to pop through on the image. I pull a lot of blues down, and I'm gonna add those blues back in. It's not showing up in this photo too much. There's not a ton of deep shadows to work with, but I'll add those blues back in with the split toning, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I'm leaving this one exactly how I have it as the preset, and you're welcome to copy all these settings and pull them over to your own preset. Next, let's look at that actual split toning or color grading. There's a lot happening here, right? I'm gonna be split toning, let's turn that on. I'm adding a lot of warmth into the highlights here, and we're adding some blues into the shadows, and you can play with both of these sliders to see how much that's actually doing. There's not a ton of blues to work with here, so you're not seeing that happen too much. The balance, you can kind of push that a little bit more if you want it to be a bit more blue, but I actually like how this one is looking a bit more warm, like I mentioned earlier. And then lastly here, under calibration, I'm not doing anything else in effects or transform. Under calibration, I'm gonna turn that off and on. We're just manipulating how we're getting these greens to look by pulling these blues down just a touch. So if I bring those up, you can see what that's doing to the greens. Because I have this a little bit more warm, I want those greens a bit more muted and maybe a bit more pulled on the warmer side, and I'm achieving that again by just pulling those blues down, and that's gonna even add a touch of red into some of these more these warmer tones here. And next, I'm gonna be working through the masks here. Just like the last image, some finishing touches, and I'm gonna be working the light a lot to focus on our focal point here and spot adding some clarity. Let's turn this on and I'll show you what we're doing here. This is gonna do a lot to the image and get the final product here. So as I turn that on, you can see we did a ton. Okay, this first mask we did is a linear gradient, and all I really did with that, and you can see where that's being applied here, all I really did is I just brought the highlights up. I wanted it to, if you look without the highlights turned up, it's a bit more of a gray feel. I wanted it to be a bit more over the top and really like punchy on those highlights. Yeah, you could bring them all the way down and try to get some detail back in those clouds. I just think that looks kind of flat. In this exact image, I think popping those whites look better. And then probably the most important slider I have here, this is the only other two. I brought the clarity down a touch. We don't want to crank that clarity. We want to try to bring that down a little bit to make these highlights a bit more soft in the sky. Look what I did to the dehaze. So you could crank the dehaze up and try to get the clouds back. Yeah, not for me. I did the opposite. I brought that all the way down, really playing off of this haze and getting these really soft, bloomy highlights to kind of roll into our main subject here. Next one, I did another linear gradient down below here. What I did with that also is I actually like made sure I painted away on the subject here on this linear gradient to make sure that it wasn't what I'm about to do to it, because I'm gonna be bringing the exposure down a bit. I want to make sure that I painted away the actual subject. We don't bring the subject exposure down. We want that to really pop. So on this linear gradient, brought the exposure down, and that's it. So exposure up, you can see what that's doing is I think it just takes away from the subject. It's really nice foreground, but I think it takes away from the subject here. So we brought that exposure down. Next, on these rocks, I just painted with a brush. I just painted these rocks a bit, and this is where I love adding spot clarity and texture. So I'm gonna bring the clarity down and the texture down, and it's fine, but I think like with these rocks, I want them to feel kind of like gritty, and you can see we don't want to bring that clarity way too high. It makes it look not natural, but I want to just spot, it's subtle, but make those rocks pop a bit as they are kind of leading up to and part of our overall subject. And then lastly, I painted out the subject here, and we just added a bit of exposure. So whenever I add exposure to this, whenever I drop, so that's how it looks without the exposure pop, right? Not so good, and that's from our other edits that we were doing with some of the shadows and the highlights, but I want this thing to really pop. And we don't want to go too far, and you can see what happens if you do that. That's no good, but I want it to give it a little bit of a light, like there's some light hit happening there, and the light source looks like it is coming from this direction. And then anytime I bring exposure up, especially on a subject or like a paint, like a brush, I want to make sure I bring the contrast with it. That way it's not, like you can see without contrast, you can kind of see it's just not quite looking right. I can probably even bring it up that far and crank the contrast and have it look natural. It's a little bit too far, but exposure up a touch, contrast up with that exposure. And here is our before and after. Bill, fantastic photo. Keep up all the great work on your YouTube channel. We'll all be tuned in for that reaction video. Our next photo comes in from Asiad, and I've had the pleasure of connecting with him on a few different occasions. And one thing that's always impressed me about him is we'll be talking about camera settings and giving him some advice on how to get his camera set up properly. But he's always very focused on wanting the story of the image to come through. And I have a ton of respect for that. Something I could get better at for sure. So a very documentary style feel. So for this photo, I knew immediately that I didn't want to do too much. I chose this photo because I think it's just a really cool photo. I'm impressed. I wouldn't mess with this kid. It's a fantastic kick he's got going on there. But I think it's a fantastic photo for this documentary style, like very storytelling image that we're not going to do a ton with. We're going to keep this very minimal. I can't help myself. I'll probably do a little bit too much, but we'll keep it as minimal as possible, which does suggest to me that my very basic, clean and minimal gym preset is going to work really well here as our baseline. That's actually a free preset, so I'll put a link down below if you want that one for free. So that's our baseline we're going to be starting with here. And so I've got this image, I've cropped it out a bit, and I've already erased. I'll show you how I did that here. I've just got the eraser tool here, and actually just erased out that emblem up there, which it's cool, but I think it does distract from our subject here a little bit. So that's one thing that I did. I also cropped it out a bit, kept our subject eyes somewhere close to the rule of thirds line here. Not quite there, but somewhere close to that, and I think it balances out pretty well. But beside that, let's go through all of the, again, I've got the majority of this edit hidden here of what we're actually doing. We'll start up top here as we normally do, and we'll finish out with the masking. Okay, so pretty standard here. We have highlights down, we got shadows up, whites up a bit, blacks down a bit. That's just a bit of a contrast feel to it. As with the majority of my presets, I'm going to be bringing this clarity slider down a bit, and I actually like bringing up dehaze a little bit here and using that one instead of our contrast slider to add a little bit of unique contrast to the image. Not much, just a touch here, but a little bit of contrast to the image. So as the preset suggests, clean and minimal. We're not doing a tremendous amount here, but there is a pretty fair amount happening here in the tone curve. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that on. I have my HSL, like the entire curve here, set to nothing, but as you guessed, just like before, all three of these are the exact same S curve, and that's where I'm getting a lot of the contrast to the image. And that's a starting point for these tones. I will play around with them a lot in the HSL in just a second, but that's what the tone curve is doing. And then going into HSL, as I mentioned, there's a lot that's happening here. Let's go ahead and turn that on. I do play with a little bit of the blues and the greens in this preset. Not much happening there, but the big part that's happening is over here in the saturation piece. So if I just turn this off, going back on that tone curve, it pushed way too much color via the contrast here. So I came down in the HSL panels and just kind of pulled back, particularly on those skin tones. And then I don't like a lot of blues. I think the blues kind of take away, not always, but can take away from the image. So I usually pull the blues down a pretty fair amount, and then I'll just kind of brighten a few of the tones up here. But pretty straightforward there. And then as we get into the actual color grading, I'm pushing the blues back into the image as I turn that on. I'm pushing the blues back into the image, both in the shadows and a touch in the highlights, and then just completely leaving these sliders alone. But once you do any adjustments here, you can actually just bring these sliders around for how much it's actually affecting, but I left that one right in the middle, just getting some of those blue tones again, that back in that we took out from the HSL. And then lastly, under calibration, if I turn that on, it's just playing with the skin tones a bit. We're just bringing the saturation of the reds up a little bit. I like doing that here, even after I go through in the HSL and I've turned those saturation down a little bit on those same exact tones. There's something about the calibration. If I turn this off and back on. I just like what it does to the skin tone a bit more than sometimes playing with those HSLs up top. So just a bit of a push back into the skin tones here. But I had a ton of fun with this image and masking. So I have that turned off right now, and as soon as I turn this on, this image is gonna change a ton. I know I said minimal, I couldn't help myself, I had to do a little bit here. Let's turn this on. That's ultimately our final product, and let's break down what's actually occurring here. The first thing is I just painted a brush on this wall up top. I wanted it to have more of a concrete feel as opposed to where it was when it was more of that, and let's turn this off for a second, more of that plywood. I think the plywood's fine. I wanted more of the concrete because I think it actually draws the eye a bit more to our subject here, but also I think the concrete feels a bit more grungy, and this style of shot to me kind of has that feel to it. Next, I isolated out our subject, and all I really did there, oh, and how I did that, by the way, back on making that more of a concrete, I brought the contrast up, I brought the shadows down, and then the saturation was where we made the most of our edit happen here. So saturate, not all the way down, it looks like it's black, one of those black and white photos that has some color pop, we don't want that. Not all the way down, so we still need to assume that it's picking up some light. So I brought it down a pretty fair amount, and then over here we just brought the clarity up and the texture up. Clarity down, it's kind of soft, it's out of focus, which makes sense, but I wanted to have, again, a bit more of a grungy pop to it, so we brought that clarity up. I think we get a bit of a concrete feel out of that. Next, we isolate out our subject, and how we do that, by the way, y'all, this is actually pretty cool. New AI feature in here. Go to select people, give it a second. It's gonna select a bunch of people. I want person 4 here. You can click person 4, you can grab the entire person, or maybe you just wanna do something with their skin or maybe their eyebrows. This gets crazy, but I just did the entire person is how I created this mask here. And then with that mask, all we did is we just brought up the exposure a little bit because I want him to pop. So if I bring it down versus we had it up just a touch on that exposure. And then when we bring up that exposure, the highlights, we don't want to be too hot. Just kind of slid and bring those highlights down to make it still look natural, but making him pop a little bit being the subject. And then lastly, I created a radial filter around our subject, and then I inverted it, and then I just played with the exposure. Right, so this doesn't look good, that's no good, that's no good, but I play with the exposure a bit just to have a very subtle piece to have the eye drawn over to our main subject. And this is what we are left with in terms of a before and after. Asia, thank you for submitting. I think you're a lot more talented than you give yourself credit for. I also appreciate all the love and support that you've shown this channel. And our next photo was submitted by a mystery person. I have no idea it definitely wasn't me. I definitely didn't submit my own photo to this. No, I did, and only because y'all have asked. This is the worst photo of the bunch, by the way, but y'all have asked like how I'm getting some of these blue tones in some of my thumbnails that you've seen. I'm gonna show you exactly how to do that extremely quickly. And how I do that is with my Pacific preset, and you can see it's doing it there, but not gonna leave you hanging. I'm gonna show you exactly what's going on with that preset. So over here, I have a lot of the panels hidden where those blues are actually affecting this image. So let's run through it. The basic treatment is similar to the other presets. It's doing a fair amount, but all we have here, I've cranked the exposure a little bit. This is just a feel. I don't do this for every single photo and just crank it up. It's just per image, like how it's gonna look. And my contrast slider, I actually do that. I tend to do my contrast slider after. I'm just gonna unhide this tone curve for a second. Once my tone curve is applied, I'll usually play with this master contrast up here to see how much, because when it's just in the center, that's how much the tone curve is actually applying contrast. So I'll just come up here and just globally just kind of see how much contrast I actually want. So let me turn that off. And then highlights down, shadows up, pretty standard. Clarity comes down for almost everything I do. And then I like adding a bit of dehaze to most of my images. Okay, next moving into that actual tone curve here, let's turn this on. It's doing a tremendous amount. I have a light pull in my shadows and my highlights here on an S curve, and then a more of an S curve here, just like before, happening in all 3 of these. And that's where I'm getting really a lot of these, this very specific contrast that I like. This is typically how I do that. And then with this preset, HSL is actually typically doing a lot. There's not a lot of colors here to be messing with those. You're not gonna see a ton happening here. But in this preset, what I've done, because we're gonna be adding so much blues here in just a moment, right, I'll be putting so much blues in just a minute, I'll talk about that. But what I've done with this panel is I've just preserved, and I'll put it right there if you wanna steal it, but I've just preserved a lot of the skin tones. So if there's a person in this shot, then we're gonna be adding some blues while preserving the skin tones and not making that person look lifeless. So moving into the actual color grading here then, let's turn this on. Here's what's happening. All that I do is I'm putting the hue of 225, the saturation at 15, into the shadows, and then I'll usually play with the blending. All right, so for this image, I might even kind of pull back just a touch here. I'll play with the blending on how much I want this actually affecting certain aspects of the image. And for this one, I want some heavy blues. And you can see that's actually doing a pretty fair amount to give us those blues, both in this case, kind of both in the highlights and the shadows. Even though I've only applied it to the shadows, when I push way over here, it's starting to apply to even some of the highlights, as you can see there. So that's how I'm gonna just put the blues in and then just play with how intense they actually are. Okay, then up here in masking, this is the final touches. I'm gonna turn that on. You can see what we're doing to the image. It's subtle, but there's some things happening here. First thing, I've selected the subject, how to do that. Select subject, it'll take care of the rest if you have an image that's crystal clear to do that with. This one absolutely is one of those. And then you can see what we're doing here. I've brought the contrast way up, right? So if I bring that down, you can see what's happening. It looks fine, but I want this to have a little bit more of a contrasted feel to the subject. And then I just play with the exposure. How much exposure do I want this subject to be popping by? So do with that there. Highlights down a bit, shadows up a bit, whites up, blacks down. And then lastly, this is important for something like a product, like a camera. I usually bring the clarity up a pretty fair amount along with the texture. And you can kind of see what both of those sliders are doing. It's fine without it. And we don't go too far, but we get a little bit of pop as we bring that clarity and texture up, just showing some of the details of this product. Next, I've selected the background. So select background and you'll get a mask around the background. Might have to paint a little bit and reduce some things, but usually does a pretty good job. And all I've done with that is I've just played with the contrast. I want this light back here to hit, and I want the shadows to be pretty harsh. So without that contrast, it looks like this, and then we can just slowly introduce that contrast. So I think with the contrast too low, it just takes away from the subject. I want that to be a little more subtle, so I crank it up like that. And here is our before and after. If you got something from this video, a bit different than my normal camera walkthrough stuff, let me know by giving it a tap on the thumbs up. It's good feedback for me. Had a ton of fun doing this. Again, thank you to everybody who submitted, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. See ya.